Earlier today on the Seattle Sports Wyman and Bob show, JP Morosi went on and talked about the Mariners offseason and talked about some names the Mariners could be getting, and that includes Bryan Reynolds. And JP says it is now more promising than ever that the Mariners do land Bryan Reynolds, which is super interesting. But before we get to the Bryan Reynolds part, we need to talk about two other players that he mentioned that might actually work out pretty well for the Mariners, and we've talked about them before. Take a listen to this part from JP, and then we'll get to it after.
Well, I think a couple names that stand out to me. Number one is Brandon Belt as a lefty that I think would complement potentially what the Mariners already have. And I think the other one is Jurickson Profar in left field.
Now, the first player that JP Morosi mentioned was Brandon Belt, the first baseman for the San Francisco Giants. As you can see on his baseball reference page, he's played the outfield, but not in like 4 years. In 2022, Belt was not good. He hit 213, 326, 350 with a 92 OPS plus. He ended up hitting 8 home runs with 23 RBI and only played in 78 games. Belt was obviously hurt in 2022. But in 2021, he hit 274, 378, 597 with a 160 OPS plus. The year before that, he had a 177. And overall, Belt has had over a 100 OPS plus pretty much his whole career, minus 2019 and 2022. Now, where exactly does Belt fit in on this roster? That's a really good question. He could definitely give days off to Ty France over at first base and could be the everyday DH for the Mariners if they wanted to go that route. Looking at Belt's splits in 2022, he was definitely better against righties, but still not that great. Looking at 2021, however, he hit 280 versus righties and 246 versus lefties. And for his career, he's a 268 versus righties and a 243 versus lefties. And overall, he could give Ty France a day off at first if need be against a tough righty. Now, that's definitely not to say that Ty France is not good versus lefties and righties. Obviously, as you can see here, he had 275 versus righties, 273 versus lefties. But all I'm saying is if you do need to give Ty France a day off and you're facing a righty, Brandon Belt is a good person to take that spot. Again, Brandon Belt has not played the outfield since 2019. Otherwise, he's basically been limited to first base and DH role in 2022. Otherwise, Brandon Belt is no longer an outfielder. He's only played 89 games in left field in his career, so you can't really fill him out there with Jarred Kelenic in left. Belt is a free agent coming off a down year. I would see him signing like a 1 year, maybe like a $5 or $6 million deal. I don't think that Belt would make all that much money at all. Another player mentioned by Morosi here is someone we've talked about before in Jurickson Profar. In 2022, he hit 243, 331, 391 with a 111 OPS plus. We're going to go pretty quick here. 15 home runs, 58 RBI. Profar would likely start for you in left field. He could also give you some versatility in the infield. And in 2022, he hit 259 versus lefties. So, of course, you could pair him with Jarred Kelenic, have Profar start versus lefties and Kelenic versus righties. Maybe that's something the Mariners want to do. Oh, this probably take a 2 or 3 year commitment for Profar, so I don't know if they want to do that. I know we've talked a lot about Bryan Reynolds before, but I think that what we're going to have to say at the end of this video might change a little bit compared to what we've seen before, so make sure to stick around. But first, we need to talk about another player that Morosi talked about, which was Anthony Santander and the Mariners trading for the Orioles outfielder. Now, Santander is 28 years old. He's played right field. He's a switch hitter, and he's not a free agent until 2025. In 2022, Santander hit 240, 318, 455 with a 117 OPS plus. Now, the Orioles have said that they don't really want to trade Anthony Santander because they still think they can make a run at this thing, but Morosi did say that he's been available multiple times over the past few years, so I don't know, maybe he's available now. Santander hit 33 home runs in 152 games. In 2021, he hit 18 home runs in 110 games with only a 94 OPS plus. Overall, he's playing in Camden Yards, which is a hitter-friendly ballpark. Santander put up a 120 WRC plus in 2022 with a 115 projection for him in 2023. Defensively, Santander has not been great with a negative 11.6 defense rating on Fangraphs with a 2.5 WAR in 2022. He is pretty heavy on the splits, however, and he might be the perfect guy to pair with somebody like Jarred Kelenic in left field, as Santander hit 293 versus lefties in 2022, whereas he hit 221 versus righties in 2022. Of course, this would require a trade, and I'm not exactly sure what the Orioles would be looking for at this point. Maybe like a Taylor Dollard or something. I definitely wouldn't give up somebody like Emerson Hancock, and probably not even Bryce Miller at this point, for somebody like Anthony Santander. But maybe like a Taylor Trammell and a Taylor Dollard, and maybe a bullpen piece for Anthony Santander. Of course, he does still have a few years left of control, so it's tough to say what the Orioles want for Anthony Santander and what they see their timeline being. Okay, now the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's listen to what Morosi has to say about Bryan Reynolds here.
You're probably looking at Yankees, Dodgers, Mariners as 3 of the strongest candidates to get Bryan Reynolds. So if you are a Mariner fan hoping and dreaming for Bryan Reynolds, switch hitting dynamo, can play great center field, but obviously would be a corner guy in Seattle, then I think last week was good for you, because the Mariners have not blocked off that possibility with any other moves. And furthermore, one of the teams that I thought was a really good fit for him went elsewhere for their lefty bat shopping and got Dalton Varsho from Arizona.
Morosi mentions that the Blue Jays are probably out of the running for somebody like Bryan Reynolds simply because they traded for Dalton Varsho. But they also traded a lot for Dalton Varsho, so if nothing else, I feel like that kind of skyrockets somebody like Bryan Reynolds' trade value. But at the same time, he's only under contract for the next 2 years, whereas somebody like Varsho is under it for the next like 5 or 6. Morosi also says that the Yankees and Dodgers are both teams that would be willing to trade for Bryan Reynolds, and they're probably the biggest competition for the Mariners. But he also says that the Mariners have a much better chance than they did before. His exact words were that it looks more promising that Bryan Reynolds will come over to the Mariners. And overall, I still like the Bryan Reynolds trade idea. And Morosi says that just Emerson Hancock and Jared Kelenic is something that could get this done, which I don't necessarily believe. I think it would take a lot more than them, and we could take a look at what that might take here in just a second. The rumor is that the Pirates are looking for pitching upside and someone that could start in the major leagues next year for the Pirates in 2023. And the Mariners definitely have that, especially with players that don't really have a place to go. With that being said, however, I've seen people throw around the idea of trading George Kirby or somebody like Logan Gilbert. Absolutely not. I would not trade them for Bryan Reynolds no matter what happened. Matt Brash, I still don't want to trade for them because he could definitely be an impact starting pitcher. But of course, all the pitchers in the minor leagues, I'm down to trade at this point. Morosi also noted that Dipoto has a greater track record in recent years of making significant trades. I do think Dipoto has been more aggressive in trades than the Dodgers or Yankees, so if I'm a Mariners fan, I'm keeping that possibility open. He's saying that last week was a good week to be a Mariners fan because the Blue Jays are now out of the running, and he wondered if the Yankees would be willing to trade some of their top pitching prospects for someone like Bryan Reynolds, which honestly I don't think they would be because the Yankees also need impact pitching. And for the Dodgers, they also have a really good lineup, whereas their pitching probably isn't as good as it should be. And before we talk about the new package for Bryan Reynolds that I put together based on what he said here, we need to talk about what he said about the Rangers. That the Rangers now have a rotation that, when healthy, is as good as the Mariners rotation. And I agree. I think it actually might be better than the Mariners rotation when it's healthy. With the addition of Nate Eovaldi, Jacob deGrom, and Andrew Heaney, those are 3 big pieces to add to your rotation. And I think that, again, like you said, if they're healthy, the Mariners would want to lengthen their lineup. And Morosi even said, that to me is worth mulling over now that you've got one of your division rivals who is at the very least going to be a lot harder to beat in 2023. So adding one more bat might behoove the Mariners, and perhaps we can see that possibility. Be it someone like Jurickson Profar, even if it's not the high-end guy like Bryan Reynolds. In my opinion, adding Jurickson Profar does help to platoon with Jared Kelenic in left field, but obviously adding Bryan Reynolds is what you would want to do in that situation. With that being said, however, Jerry Dipoto has said that he doesn't like the idea of reactionary trades. He doesn't like the idea of just because somebody did one thing, now you need to pivot and do another thing to try to keep up with that somebody. He's said that before, and honestly, that's kind of been true based on how good the Astros have been making trades and how they've been at signing players lately. Jerry Dipoto doesn't really seem to be reactionary and wanting to make a pivot move to counteract their moves. In 2022, Reynolds did hit 345, 461, 807 with a 126 OPS plus. He hit 27 home runs with 62 RBI in 145 games. He was an all-star in 2021 in 159 games, where he hit 24 home runs, 90 RBI. He also hit 302, 390, 522 with a 145 OPS plus. Bryan Reynolds is somebody that, as a Mariners fan, you would love to have him on your team. He could probably hit at the top of the order for you and maybe move Julio down to 2. He's a switch hitter who is going into his age 28 season, which is usually when players hit their prime. He won't be a free agent until 2026, so you have some time with Bryan Reynolds if you do make that trade. Reynolds put up a 6.1 WAR in 2021, and it dropped to a 2.9 in 2022. So he was definitely a better player in 2021. His WRC plus also shows that with a 141 and a 125 in 2022. We're trying to go through this quick because we've talked about all these numbers before, but if you do want to check out those numbers in a little bit slower fashion, we have that video on the screen at the end of this video. Again, Bryan Reynolds is a switch hitter, and throughout his career, he is an exactly even hitter between lefties and righties, hitting 281 versus both. In 2022, he hit 273 versus lefties and 258 versus righties. So overall, you don't need to platoon with him like you would with Jared Kelenic in left field. Okay, so once again, we've talked about Bryan Reynolds before and what kind of trade package it would take. We're going to go off of what JP Morosi said here and start with Jared Kelenic and Emerson Hancock. That's what Morosi said in this interview, and I honestly think that that is a really good starting point. I would hate to see Kelenic go because I feel like he's going to be good, but alas, it is what it is. Emerson Hancock's definitely fallen off. And what Morosi said was, and if they would do Hancock and Kelenic for Reynolds, and if you like your chances to sign Reynolds long term, I think you do it. I think even if you don't like your chances for signing Bryan Reynolds long term, you probably make that trade because Hancock and Kelenic is a very small amount to give up for somebody like Bryan Reynolds. It's interesting that Morosi thinks that just those 2 players would get this deal done. I would think at least you would need to throw in one of Bryce Miller or Taylor Dollard to go along with that deal, and maybe even that compensatory draft pick that you have in the 30s in 2023. Honestly, if I was to make this deal, and if Morosi thinks that just Kelenic and Hancock could get it done, I'm going to also throw Taylor Dollard in there as well as that compensatory draft pick. Make it a 4-for-1 trade basically, because the Mariners already have 2 other draft picks. I think having that draft pick is really good to be able to throw it around. I would give up Hancock, Kelenic, Dollard, and the draft pick for Bryan Reynolds straight up. Whether or not the Pirates would take that deal, I'm not sure. It'd be a real shame to see Kelenic go over there and hit bombs and Hancock maybe become an ace. But you have to give up something to get something, and I think Reynolds is a key piece the Mariners could be missing. Adding Bryan Reynolds would definitely be a dynamic force for the Seattle Mariners, and we actually had a video that we talked about a few weeks ago with Joe and I, where we talked about our deal for Bryan Reynolds. This was before all these reports come out. I would like you to check that video out on the screen now. I appreciate you guys watching this one, and go Mariners.